Chapter 4 The Empire in Transition. So, for a while now, England has been leaving America alone to govern themselves. This is their policy called salutary neglect. So, because of that, there are powerful colonial legislatures, what they consider little parliaments. However, they still view themselves as English citizens, and people from Carolina were like, ew, people from Georgia, we're so different from you. They considered colonists from each colony didn't consider themselves the same as someone from another colony. So when Benjamin Franklin proposes the Albany Plan to unite the colonies, it's unanimously rejected. They're like, no, we want to stay separate for now. Yeah. So then, there's the conflict between the English, French, and the Iroquois. The French expand their presence in America, almost all of the colonial interior, including Louisiana. They shared this land with the Indians, and they were very tolerant of the Indians' beliefs. They sometimes even assimilated themselves into the Indian culture. They had very good relations with each other. So, the area of conflict between the French, the English, and the Iroquois was the Ohio River Valley. And, okay, let's back it up a little bit. There have been on and off wars between England and France/Spain, and they had a territorial dispute, and England and France were pitted against each other. And even the colonies were brought into the war, and this was called the King George's War. After the King George's War, relations between the English, French, and Iroquois deteriorate. So, the English are encroaching on the Ohio River Valley, and so are the French. And of course the Indians are there too. The French had Fort Duquesne. The English had Fort Necessity, and the English attacked the French fort, and then the French attacked the English fort, and the English surrendered in that battle. So, this kicks off what is known as the French and Indian War, even though the British were part of the war as well. In the first phase, the English colonists were pretty much alone. The British didn't provide much help against the French and the Indians. The colonists defend against the Indian raids on their western settlements. In the second phase, France and England formally declare war, and they call it the 7 Years' War. During the second phase, a man called William Pitt brings the American war effort under British control. He enacts something called impressment, which forcibly enlists colonists in the army. However, the Americans resist the British policies that Pitt puts into the second phase of the war. Okay, so during the third phase, William Pitt relaxes the policies that the colonists hate. So then the English capture many French forts, Louisbourg, Quebec, and Montreal, and that's pretty much when England wins the war. So then there was the Peace of Paris, in which France basically just gives up all the territory that it has in North America. England gets Canada and lands east of the Mississippi River, and Spain gets Louisiana, which is west of the Mississippi River. So the effects of the war, they're like in debt horribly because of the war. So now they think they need increased control over the colonies. colonies have for once united against a common foe, and they do not want British interference at all. And, well, the Indians. The Iroquois Indians, during the war, they basically played the English and French off each other, but they ended up being on the England side, on the winning side of the war. So, at the end of the war, the Indian alliances, most of the Indians were allied with the French, but any alliances that were formed disintegrated, especially the ones on the side of the French. They were on the losing side, so they were scared of the British. But the Iroquois didn't fare much better either. So then, Empire, the British Empire. Now we're focusing on the Empire. The Americas were originally viewed as commercially important to Britain because of trade and such between the colonies and the mercantilism. Now they are valued based on their land and population and the taxes they could bring in. This is called the commercial imperialist versus territorial imperialists. King George III gains control of Parliament, but here's the problem. King George III is a crazy head, which means he's like insane most of the time. So this leads to instability in the British government at a key part of America's history. So, during this time, George Grenville is the Prime Minister of Britain. He enacts a system of control over the colonies. He wants to reel in them. He wants to make them do what he wants. So, when the English encroach on the Indians' land, there becomes a rebellion called Pontiac's Rebellion. They raid a lot on their settlements. So, because of the Indian rebellions, the Proclamation of 1763 states that English colonists cannot go beyond a certain line. They can't encroach on Indian lands beyond them, but they pretty much. The goals were to limit westward expansion and prevent conflicts with the Indians, but it failed to meet those expectations. So then, Britain enacts the Sugar Act, which imposes a tax on sugar, Currency Act, which bans all colonial currency, and the Stamp Act, and the colonists hate all of those. They just do. However, the colonists still had grievances toward each other, so they couldn't unite against the British yet. So, the colonists had their grievances against each other, so the Paxton Boys demanded relief from the colonial taxes, and they wanted help defending themselves against the Indians. And in the regulator movement, there were farmers who opposed the high colonial taxes once again, and so they armed themselves and resisted taxation by force. However, they were put down in the Battle of Alamance, unfortunately for them. So, the colonies sought to resist British control and maintain self-government. The colonists viewed the Stamp Act as England's attempt to raise revenue without the consent of the colonies, and that was a big issue for them. The Trump of Sedition encourages colonists to resist. Patrick Henry introduces what's called the Virginia Resolves, that they say that the American Americans possess the same rights as the English do, particularly the right to be taxed only by their own representatives. And then the Stamp Act Congress basically petitions for the same thing. The Sons of Liberty were a big group that rebelled against England throughout this period, particularly against the Stamp Act. The English repealed the Stamp Act not because of the petitions and the rebellions. It was basically because nobody was buying their goods, and they wanted money. It's always about greed. So they repealed it so people would buy their goods again. However, when they did this, they did the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's authority over all of the colonies. However, the colonies didn't really pay attention to this. They were just focused on the appeasement part of it. But later that would become majorly important. So, a man named Charles Townshend takes control of he enacts the Mutiny or Quartering Act. The colonies hated it not because of the actual quartering, but because it was now mandatory. They saw it as another taxation without representation thing. They didn't want to do it because it was mandatory. So Townshend did a couple of things, and he had specific goals. He disbanded the New York Assembly in hopes that, until they obeyed the Mutiny Act. And he did only one colony in hopes that not to arouse all the colonies at once, but it did. Another thing he did was impose taxes on English goods that were imported. So he said this was an external tax, and what the colonies earlier had said, okay, you can't tax us internally, but external taxes are okay, but the result was the opposite. They were mad at the tax once again. So the Massachusetts Assembly urges all colonies to stand up against every tax imposed by Parliament. Let's see. Townshend attempts to disband smuggling, but this just encourages it elsewhere because it was only banned in one city. So all the colonies boycotted goods subject to the tax. And so because of that, there was a lot of stuff they couldn't buy, so colonial goods became popular instead. So then we move on to what's called the Boston Massacre. Now first, background information. The British put a bunch of new troops in the city of Boston. And so the Liberty Boys got mad, and they started throwing rocks and snowballs at the troops. And they retaliated and started firing into the crowd and killing at least 5 people, including Crispus Attucks, probably the first African to die for the cause of American independence. So the Boston Massacre became a symbol of British oppression and brutality, even though the colonists provoked it. Samuel Adams forms a committee of correspondence to publicize the grievances against England throughout the colony. So, okay, in England, they believe that the government is necessary to protect people from the evil in one another. However, the government is run by corruptible people, so they need safeguards against the abuses of power in government. However, the English system of government was becoming corrupt tyranny. The English were willing to accept changes in government, while the Americans wanted a sense of permanence and stability. Also, the English and Americans had differing views on representation. The English said that every member in Parliament represented not only the entire nation, but also the entire empire, including the colonies. However, the Americans viewed representation as representatives from a certain community represented that community, and each community was represented. So, the Americans came up with the slogan, "No taxation without representation." They wanted to tax themselves. They didn't want people who they didn't, like, say, Parliament, they didn't have representation there, so they didn't want them taxing them. So, resistance. They resisted against the Navigation Acts and through discussing ideas. Then, the Tea Act allows Britain to undersell its competitors selling tea. However, this act excludes the merchants that had been in this trade, and it's an unconstitutional tax. So, why would they want to pay it? So this encourages mass popular protest. As more of these acts come about, the more times people unite to protest against it. A group called Daughters of Liberty participates in anti-British activities. This is women. Women kind of have power, at least in that respect. So then the British get mad and they dump all the tea into the British Harbor, and it's called the Boston Tea Party. Everybody knows about that. So then, because of that, Britain gets mad again. So they enact what's called the Coercive / Intolerable Acts, which closes the Boston port, drastically reduces self-government, and requires the quartering of troops. Then there was the Quebec Act, which didn't directly affect the colonies, but it recognized the legality of the Roman Catholic Church in the French colony of Quebec. But the colonists viewed this as a threat that they would be affected by the Pope's tyranny. That didn't happen. Then they had the First Continental Congress, delegates from all 13 colonies except for Georgia. Why are you not there, Georgia? Anyway. It decided 5 things, but not many of them were that influential. One of them was that non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption as a way to stop all trade with Britain. Then there was the conciliatory propositions, which was that colonies tax themselves at Parliament's demand, which was, it seems to me, basically the same thing as Parliament taxing them, but whatever. Then Lexington and Concord. So basically, the colonists were hiding gunpowder and stuff, and they weren't supposed to have it. It was illegal. So General Thomas Gage from the British went to go arrest the Colonials Sam Adams and John Hancock. He hoped to surprise them, but the Americans knew what was going on. And so we get how Paul Revere rode on his horse through the towns, saying, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" So the men of the colonists were prepared at Lexington. And as they fought in Lexington and Concord, at the end of the battle, Britain had lost 3 times more men than had the colonists. And these were known as the shots heard round the world, though nobody knows who fired the first shots. And therefore, the American Revolution began.